Welcome to Commander Runningcloud's log. Well, let me remind you that exopolitical diplomacy is the process of communicating with the good ETs that Courtney Brown of Farsight has told us about. And exopolitical is a term that has been promoted by the founder of the Exopolitical Journal, Michael Sala. So working with those traditions of believing that good ETs are here to help liberate our planet, and having discovered Exopolitical website and journal about a month ago, I started this process of directly communicating with the good ETs as a part of what would come under anthropology for them. And I would be a native informant. That would be my role, according to the definitions created by Jonathan Culler about the roles in anthropology. Okay? So that's why I'm here. You might also remember that I'm the author of Ivy League Faculty Plagiarism, Letha and Hazel in Paris, The Emails, which is an epistolary documentary of how I was plagiarized at Yale and how that followed me through my career to the University of Massachusetts, where I didn't get my degree because the professors on my committee refused to read my work, just like the professors at Yale refused to read my work except when they stole it and gave it to other people. Valerie Smith, the president of Swarthmore, plagiarized my work after Hazel gave it to her, and Brent Hayes Edwards of Columbia University plagiarized my work, which Henry Louis Gates stole from the Ford Foundation. Okay, so I don't have a doctorate. I don't have any credentials. That's the way the enemies wanted it to be. You also might remember that when my mother died, I inherited a share of a multi-million-dollar estate. My mother was a circuit court judge in Chicago, Llewellyn, Latimer, Green, Tepeti. And when my stepfather died, a neurosurgeon immigrant from South Africa, Isaac Martin Tepeti, when he died there in Bullhead City, Arizona, I was also an heir to a $1 billion estate, to part of a $1 billion estate. But my brother, former Illinois State Representative Andre Martin Tepeti, robbed me of my trust fund, and no probate lawyers would represent me. They were all too afraid because we don't work on law anymore. We work on political bullies. So yesterday, after my report, I was feeling pretty good. But then I saw the results of the election in Mexico, and it just blew my mind altogether. I said, oh my God, Mexico elected a woman and a Jew woman? I was shocked. And the reason I was shocked was because of the things that I learned when I studied Spanish literature, Mexican American literature at the University of Massachusetts. I actually took an entire semester's course with Luis Morentes, whose picture you see on the thumbnail. Yes, Luis Morentes had a course on Mexican American literature. And in his course, I learned two terms that are really important: La Malinche and Pocho. La Malinche and Pocho. I'm going to read to you the definitions of La Malinche from Wikipedia. La Malinche. I had to enter La Malinche, Mexico. Oh, because this is. Let me do a little more a little more of the introduction first. Psychology is a study of the individual behavior. Sociology is a study of group dynamics and how it influences individual behavior and how groups react. Politics is the study of how people govern themselves, who makes the rules, who enforces the rules, who makes the decisions for how the groups will interact. Anthropology studies all of those systems in different civilizations, and anthropology has often been used to gather intelligence about the cultural values before the invaders move in. Okay? So you've got psychology, sociology, politics, and anthropology. Okay? And each one of those is a discipline in a university. Each one of those is something you can actually study and major in. History is the reflection on all of that. Okay? So somewhere after anthropology comes history, because history is the final consensus about what happened, using different kinds of lenses to accent what you're going to look at. Different kinds of hierarchies of data determine the history you create. And you can have a lot of histories. You can have competing histories. There's a Nigerian saying, an adage, a proverb that says it, that the victors tell the story of the history. Only they put it in lion terms or something, but that whoever wins gets to say what happened. Well, that's not always the case. So I want to sort of start this, since this is about the election in Mexico. I want to start this looking at the culture of Mexico as I learned it in Luis Morente's class at the University of Massachusetts. Now, I didn't learn it I learned it from the books and from the papers that I wrote. A democracy is a political system that privileges individuals. The ideal democracy means that everybody has a voice in every decision that's made that relates to the public and the way the people live. Okay? So a political system determines how individuals live, what their privileges are, what the laws are, everything like that. The Declaration of Independence was written for and about Europeans to define their engagement of war, their manifest destiny mandate in America. It wasn't written to protect the American people at all. You can look at the Hinsdale College lectures. If you have any doubt about it, their professors will be very specific about letting you know that the that the Constitution of the United States of America was written to protect the Europeans from the Europeans overseas and define what the booty would be, how they would conduct themselves, essentially as a colony. But in that Declaration of Independence, the language was ambiguous enough to make every American feel included, because they wouldn't have been able to continue the invasion with their small military forces if Americans and Mexicans and Canadians, the real ones, the ones that actually own the land, if they had known that they were the targets in a centuries-long war. If we'd known we were targets, we wouldn't have had Thanksgiving quite the way that it went off, would we? We wouldn't have had so many different things that have led to genocidal conditions for the real Americans, the real Canadians, and the real Mexicans. A pure democracy is what we were all sold. It's what we were all sold, was the idea of a pure democracy. And in a pure democracy, if you're an adult and you have a reasonable level of intelligence, then you are included in every decision that relates to your life and the life of the other people in your nation. And we took the nation to be different things at different times. But the way I see the nation is the North American continent. I see Canada and Mexico as a part of America because it's continental at the end. Although the Europeans broke it up with borders and said, okay, this is Canada, we'll have one strategy for invading Canada, and this is the United States, we'll have one strategy for conquering the United States, and this is Mexico, we'll have another strategy for conquering Mexico. And part of it has to do with the geography and the climate in each one of those places demands a different kind of strategy. Because of the temperate climate zones in the United States territory, you can move more aggressively, right? And there were also more tribes settled here. There were more tribes of Americans living in this part of the country. So the Europeans were able to test a lot of their war strategies on the United States of America bordered territory. I'm going to use the European borders for convenience, but I'm going to say something else. We all know that our broadcast news has been taken over largely by people well practiced in blood libel, which is the art of influencing to hide crime. It's the art of influencing and reporting to hide the operations of criminals engaged in murder and genocide. As I've told you many times before, blood libel was invented as a term in the 1100s in Eastern Europe, probably around the Ukraine. And it was the reaction to a pogrom that happened, not to the Jews, although they became Jews later when they moved to Israel, but to the Jeffrey Epsteins that were kidnapping and murdering children and had an entire industry developed on baby meat. And when the local people found the abattoir where their children were being slaughtered, they just went after the offending group. And the survivors of that grand pogrom said, this will never happen again. We must tighten up our strategy. So they learned to infiltrate politics. They learned to control public opinion through the news, and the Gutenberg press helped them distribute the news. Television helped them distribute the news even more. The movies, the newspapers, public radio, all of this became a part of the blood libel machine to influence public opinion and to hide the crime using blood libel strategies. So you've got public opinion all wrapped up in broadcasting. You've got law and legislation all wrapped up in the politics, because our political system has executive, judicial, and what's the third branch of government? The House of Representatives and, all of those legislations, judicial and legislative branches. Executive, the president, the judicial, the courts, and the legislative branch, the lawmakers, which are the elected representatives. But we always want to ask the question, with the diversity in America, how come only Europeans got elected to the seats of power? How come only Europeans came to occupy the courts? Okay? And then we learn from Bill and Jane Mount that in order to be of standing in a court in this nation, you have to be accredited by the British Accreditation Registry, the Bar Association. Now, as we go through these different kinds of things, it's extremely important for us to remember my goodness, she's loud, isn't she? I can still hear her through the closed door. It's very important for us to remember that all these things evolve, okay? These things, it's like the frog that's sitting in the pot of cool water, and the temperature rises slowly and slowly and slowly until the frog is cooked. But by the time it realizes that it's boiling, its legs are already meat. It's already cooked. It can't escape the trap. And that is how democracy has unfolded in America for us. Okay? We're not stupid. We didn't consent. We didn't submit. They slowly wrapped this system around us, just like they did the entire concept and practice. Slavery wasn't nearly what it became after slavery ended. You can read John Blassingame's slave narratives from the Work Progress Association of World War II collections. They interviewed former slaves and survivors of slavery, and more people didn't even know that there was such a thing as slavery. They couldn't even remember when they saw a European. But they created Hollywood, Hollywood slavery, where they created horrible things until they could actually get the Ku Klux Klan in place. Okay, so by the time the Civil War came, they were able to actually legislate and call people former slaves who had never been slaves. And they were actually able to use Jim Crow and European nationalist racism, because they said, oh, you guys were slaves. And we were like, we weren't slaves. And they were like, yeah, you were. And they used the census to identify where we lived and the lands that we possessed. So they could use that as their war map, their map for war. And they would know where to infiltrate to undermine the communities. Okay, so a democracy ideally means one man, one vote. Okay, we're not going to go with the Constitution and all that racism. We're just going to go with the way it was sold to us and the way it was taught to us in high school. I couldn't graduate from high school, from Aquinas Dominican High School, without taking American government. And a family emergency made me miss a lot of class, and I had to have a meeting with the nuns at Aquinas Dominican. I'd just gotten there that November from Canada and DC, and then Chicago, Aquinas. And Sister Thomas Ellen insisted that I could not graduate until I took an American history test and an American government test, until I passed her class with an exam. So I had to study American government and history. So I know what they were teaching us about what a democracy was and how the government worked. And I'll swear to God, after I studied, I still didn't really understand much, except one thing. If there's such a thing as an electoral college, doesn't that kind of defeat the entire concept of one man, one vote? If your vote gets subsumed into individuals hand-selected to be in an electoral college, then you really didn't get to vote. It's just like a union, isn't it? That's probably where they got the idea for the unions. So even in high school studying American government, you could see that there was a huge logical fallacy built in. And we talked about that too in this Commander Runningcloud's log series on YouTube. We talked about logical fallacies. And there is definitely a logical fallacy, a paraconsistent logic in the idea of a democracy where the Electoral College actually makes decisions. But the idea of one man, one vote is wonderful. We all like that because it really reinforces our equality, right? And I just have to go to God. God sees us all as worthy of being created, of worthy of being here. There are no accidents. We are all here because we are supposed to be here. And God loves us, every one of us, equally. I really believe that. Even the ones that are going to perish, God loves them. God mourns because they had free will, but they made the wrong decisions. If democracy were real, the cell phones that we use to do our banking, which is about as individual and secure as can be, and you can't function as an adult in America without a bank account. Yet we trust our cell phones and the internet to do our banking. And over time, things have evolved where if you don't have a cell phone, you can't participate in the society or the economy. So we know everybody can connect to the internet somehow, even if they have to go to the public library. And we know that we are so individually tracked by our telephone numbers and biometric data and voice prints that fraud would be pretty near impossible to get away with. And we all know that the blockchain relies on not deleting anything because that's the real estate of cyberspace. That's the land of cyberspace where they're constructing things, where they're using distributed processing to process data. And we all know that. So we all know that we could pretty much vote on everything now, right? Every decision that a politician makes is something that we all could have access to and be able to give our opinion about it. This is something that's possible. And if we had developed truly as a democracy, that would be an application of technology that we would be enjoying right now. We would be enjoying our access to govern ourselves as a democracy, where everybody gets to give their input like a tribal council. And everybody's input is considered by everybody in the group that's subject to these consequences of these decisions. And everybody votes on the decision to be made. And the majority of votes makes the decision. Now, we all know that when it comes to privatizing water in Arizona and Utah and building water canals that go all the way from the Rocky Mountains in Canada straight down into Mexico and into Mexico, we all know that when those decisions are made, we all could have a vote about it, and we all should have a vote about it, because the privatization of water is a threat to everyone. The outlawing of individuals accessing the fresh water reservoir that is constantly replenished, that Linda Moulton Howe teaches us about. They outlaw that. They outlaw us growing crops. They outlaw us raising our own lambs and cows to feed ourselves and our families, because they want to have ultimate control in a Marxist political system. Control of production, control of the assets is control of the individual. So we could have a real democracy where everyone is honored for their intelligence and their ability to make decisions for themselves and the people around them. But instead, we found our power getting siphoned off more and more and more and more and more until we find ourselves powerless and subject to foreign entities that run corporations. And we find that our very democratic government itself uses foreign corporations to get its business done and has acknowledged itself as organized as a private corporation, a privately held corporation, the United States of America Corporation. Okay? But in the Du Boisian double consciousness, that's the lie they tell. That's the public deception. That's the blood libelous illusion. That's the matrix. But over here, we've got reality. Over here, we've got reality. And they talk to the reality part of ourselves. They talk to our classical logic when they say, well, you're living in a democracy. That means your vote counts. So, once we all believe our vote counts, and we all see that the great crowds showed up for Donald Trump, and that Joe Biden was being accused of accepting bribes from the Russians and the Chinese, wasn't it? I don't know who the bribes were from, but Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, they were already reporting the stories about Joe Biden during the election. And Joe Biden was so old, and the alternative news that wasn't co-opted was already saying Joe Biden is dead. They were already saying Joe Biden is dead. You know, they said they executed John McCain. They got rid of Doug Ducey in Arizona. I think they might have even gotten rid of the former president of Mexico, who worked with Donald Trump to secure the border. The one that this most recent election supposedly replaced. So when we look at what is in the public space and what we know that Joe Biden is too old and infirm to be a president. We also know that he's been engaged in crime, international crime. He sold out America. We also know that he is a outspoken racist. These are all things we know. These are bits of knowledge that are actually in the public space. But then we get this running dialogue among the blood libelists that say Joe Biden did this, Joe Biden did that. I even heard that they served Rudy Giuliani a subpoena to further the intimidation against people that dare speak out about how funny the last election went down. But George Bush was the biggest beta test, and the hanging Chad from Florida, where his brother lives. And once we all swallowed that, stealing the election altogether became easy because they knew that we did not have a political organization to resist them. We had individuals, and they were manipulating our psychology by telling us so many conflicting truths that we just wanted peace of mind and one way that we could look at it. Because we couldn't act on what we knew to be the truth, right? When the Europeans declared all my people had been slaves, the only thing we could do was make sure our oral history stayed intact. So my great-grandmothers, my great-great-grandmothers, plural, were sure to tell my grandfather to pass it on to me and me to my children that we were never slaves. We met the Mayflower. Okay? But look how far they get with this mythology of slaves. Look how it affects the individual. In the 8th grade, the New York State teachers even gave me an award in creative writing, and all I wrote about was imagining what it would be like to be a slave. Except I wrote one good poem that wasn't about that at all. But the story I wrote that was published in the literary journal that my teacher, Mrs. Brawley, at PS 142 in Jamaica, New York, published for me. She published a journal of art because of my poetry, because of the work I submitted in her class. And she published 2 of my pieces. And one of the stories was about what it would be like to be a woman, an American woman in the time of slavery, being subjected to all that abuse. But the fact of it is my people were landowners during the times of slavery. And when the laws and the economy wrapped around them and said, well, if you own land and you got people working on your land, then you're a slave owner. That wasn't true. We just had a lot of land that they called plantations. But they deprived us of all that. They deprived us of our land as a part of the war machine. And they broke up our tribes as a part of the war machine. Now, this entire time, we knew about the Trail of Tears. We knew about slavery, but they said they brought us here. There was nobody here before they got here. It was just barren land. And they brought us here, and then they built everything up. That's the lie that they would tell. But the truth is we were already here. Now, when you know that we were already here, it changes the politics completely. When you knew we were already here, you can understand why the Constitution of the United States of America Corporation was a conversation between the European royals in Europe that owned the Europeans here and their allegiance, and the Europeans here, and how they would conduct the invasion that would continue for hundreds of years. A pure democracy means that you trust everybody has enough intelligence to know what's good for them. A real democracy means that everybody gets to voice their opinion, and everybody gets to listen to the opinions, and everybody gets to process the data, and everybody gets to make a decision, and everybody gets to vote. And the belief is that the majority will have more capability of making the best decision for everybody else. John Stuart Mills would call this utilitarianism, where the greatest good for the greatest number of people becomes the decision, the platform that you build upon, that you build the next layer of your society upon. Yeah, John Stuart Mills was just about the only worthwhile thing I got out of being forced to study British literature for 2 years to get my degree and credentials from Northwestern. You know, you don't find out that they wrapped it all up, that they're using cultural immersion. They erase my culture and make their culture the center of the universe. So we all have a common language in their culture, but then our culture is wiped out. And Hazel Carby and Henry Louis Gates, they have been a part of erasing American literature for the past 100 years. And that was why they blacklisted me. And I ended up at the University of Massachusetts, a state school. But I got to take Mexican literature there with Luis Morentes. Luis Morentes was a terrible racist and sexist. Terrible, terrible man. He asked me why I wrote my second paper on a different topic instead of just revising the first paper. And he gave me a B. Even though my oral presentation went on longer, I had a projector doing visuals for, audio visual accompaniments. And when I finished my lecture, he looked at me with absolute envy. And the class was totally delighted. They were like so uplifted after my oral presentation that probably took 45 minutes, maybe the whole hour, I don't know. And then Malinche gave me a B. But I'll tell you why I think he gave me a B. In the beginning of the semester, I sit in the front row because my mother always taught me, sit in the front row, because she had read these studies that said students that sit in the front row tend to get higher grades, they tend to pay more attention, blah, 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 right? So during the first week of class, I'm sitting in the front row, and Luis Marentes is right there, right in front of my face. And he had the biggest piece of snot in his nose that I've ever seen. But I had to keep looking at him, not every moment, but I had to keep looking at him, and I'm wondering, wow, that booger is so big, how come he can't feel it and wipe it away? But he didn't. He didn't wipe that booger out of his nose. It wasn't until after the break that it was gone. So I'm sure that when he pulled that big thing out of his nose and took a look at it, he had to know that I had seen it the entire time. And when he came back in the classroom after the break with a clean nose, he looked at me with humiliation and embarrassment. And I often thought that more than the racism, more than the sexism, more than the, Spanish language speaking arrogance, that Luis Marentes was going to give me a bad grade for revenge because I saw that great big huge booger sitting in his nose. That's the thing I remember about him the most, is how he had that booger in his nose. But I would have forgotten the booger altogether. It happens, it happens. I would have forgotten it altogether if he hadn't been so mean, right? And envious, and given me a B on my record after how hard I worked in that class. But here's the good part. What I learned in that class relates to my critique of the election in Mexico, where they supposedly elected a female Jew, who looks mixed race, but her name is unmistakably Jew. It isn't Marentes, it isn't Rodriguez, it isn't Alvarez, it isn't Gonzalez, it's Scheinbaum. Or something like that. That's definitely a signal to the world, isn't it? That's a signal to the world about the business deals that are going to be made to sell the resources of Mexico to foreign companies like they did in the United States. That's a signal that aqueduct working its way down south, working its way down Western America, is going to be advancing rapidly through Mexico. Because it's already there. I saw it. I saw them building out. I watched them develop the highways and the property and the aqueduct. I followed the water. So a Jew woman president of Mexico is really going to advance the privatization of water in the Americas, isn't it? Because now she has the political power to control all the assets, just like Joe Biden can give our money to the people that created blood libel, the people that murdered children and created human trafficking, the people that actually made human trafficking an intergalactic enterprise. They were able to use their new alien friends that were made by Hitler in World War II to actually take their destruction of the human fabric and commodify human beings in other galaxies as a diet, as a nutritional treat. Our babies. Well, we all know, I mean, if you keep up with all the different faces of the news, we all know that Donald Trump had two ships, the Comfort, was it the Comfort and the Hope, where American doctors and doctors from all over the world came to treat the children that had been held in underground dungeons as a part of the human trafficking, the human meat. In Arizona, I actually saw some of the cages that those children were kept in a storage bin. Let me repeat that the good ETs have been working here as a ground force for a very long time. They are the ones I believe that have been responsible for my training and education in all of these areas that go beyond even the alternative journalists that seem very organized as much as the blood libelist ones, is how they seem to me, because they still shy away from the absolute truth. I guess because they know they'll be shut down if they do. You know, we still do not have enough power. But the people that train and teach me arranged for me to see these cages that would look like you'd have a lion in them, but there were many, 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 many of these cages. But they weren't tall enough for a person. There was only one thing that you could do with these cages, and that is keep people in them. But if you're an adult, you wouldn't be able to stand. And then later, when I saw pictures of these cages, I could recognize them, right? And we all know that Twitter was one of the places where they openly spoke about things they had. We all knew that Wayfair furniture was being used to ship drugged children to different residences. These are things that we all knew. And we all knew that Donald Trump stood against these things. And we knew that Donald Trump was helping to end this horrible human trafficking. But the blood libelists had a global organization, you see. They were already everywhere by the time Donald Trump came up to try to save us. They were already everywhere. So they took him out. And then they used him as a political effigy and dragged the Donald Trump avatar through all of their courts and beat him up just like you would any other effigy of a politician. And now that Donald Trump is in a position that nobody wants to be in, they go after Rudy Giuliani for continuing to teach people that election was crooked, as crooked as can be. But once the people that want to take over America, North America, once they realize that they can get away with stealing an election in America, don't you think that that's a lot of the reason why they were able to say that they elected through a democratic process a Jew woman, a woman Jew, a female Jew, a young female Jew to rule Mexico? Ay, ay, ay! Caramba! I don't believe it, do you? I don't believe it any more than I believe that Joe Biden is anything more than the leader, a dictator installed after a coup and the murder of the president. So, in a democracy, it's one man, one vote. And because it's one person, one vote, there's an automatic assumption, a logical premise, that everybody has a good enough brain, that everybody has a good enough sense of morality, that everybody is just plain good enough for their opinion to count in a decision that relates to everyone. Okay? And that affects them as an individual, that affects them as a community, that affects them as a larger and larger and larger political units that have been defined, right? Larger and larger political units. But when I used to imagine a democracy and the role of technology in our democracy, that's how I saw it. I said, wow, they're going to be able to put every single item of consideration that politicians are deciding. They're going to be able to put it in the public online, and every citizen's going to be able to vote. And then we'll really have a democracy. We'll really have a society that reflects the values of the people living in it. And do you think that if we all could have voted on which corporation gets to control our assets and which corporations get to live and which corporations get to die, don't you think small businesses would have gotten much more prosperous within our nation? That's what I think. And if small business got more prosperous, individuals would have gotten more prosperous. And do you want to know what would have happened then? More baseball teams, more soccer teams, more Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts organizations, because you would have had the manpower and the resources to build your culture and your society. In America, the blood libelists took their time undermining the role of mothers and women in the community. But the number of hours of free labor that women put into building communities is why the communities are so good when they are so good. It's volunteering by the women. As they raise their children, they raise your children too. And that was a part of the role of woman in our society. In the Indian tribes that predate the Europeans coming here, the women would decide who the next chiefs would be. You weren't a chief because your father was a chief. You had to earn your right to be the chief. And because the women were the ones that took care of the children while the men protected the community and provided hunting for the community, provided the meat, the women grew the crops, helped grow the crops after the men tilled the land with their superior muscular strength. And the children helped plant the seeds. And the women, through raising their children, actively engaged with children, the women were able to see the character and the personality of each child. And the women were able to know which individual children would make the best chiefs. Which boy should be the chief? Which boys should be on the leadership council? And this would be decided by the boys that cared the most about the other people. Not the boy that was the biggest bully. No. That wasn't the boy who got to be the chief. The boy most likely to keep the tribe safe and move it forward would be the boy who could be the chief. Well, that was the role of women in pre-European society, to pick the new leaders, to raise the children, to give them moral values and food and the things that they needed. So that role changed as we became bigger and bigger and bigger, as communities got bigger. And instead of having individuals, you started having multi-tribal communities. Okay, because you couldn't marry in your own tribe because that would be incestuous. You had to talk to other tribes. You had to differentiate your DNA with other tribes. So the tribes weren't fighting, they were trying to meet each other so they could get together and fall in love and have families. It wasn't about war. That's something we are taught. Just like everywhere the Europeans go as archaeologists, they report back on places they think human sacrifices may have taken place because of their human meat business over there in the Ukraine, over there where blood libel got started, over there where the first pogrom took place, over there where the citizens found that their kidnapped children that were not in the clan, that were not protected, by the group of slaughterers. They found their children in the abattoir. Well, they're always going out looking. Where was the human sacrifice? Oh, this looks like it was human sacrifice. They don't think of it as a place where people wanted to be closer to God and brought flowers and sang or something like that, you see. That didn't come into their minds because their consciousness was built on murder, human sacrifice, war. So everywhere they looked, that's what they saw. They saw war. They saw human sacrifice. They saw pain and suffering everywhere they went. In Arizona, ancient Indian sites are surrounded by high-rise buildings. They're surrounded by corporate buildings of the Europeans. And you can see the ruins there, and you can see the European buildings all around on the street side. And then behind it, you see the ruins. All over America, there are ruins. Ruins that belong to my people, my tribes, and the ancient ones. The ones that were here on this landmass before the previous 4 cataclysmic events that wiped out most of the humans. The Hopi have a tradition that during the last 2 cataclysmic events, the ant people took the survivors underground. And that's really funny because when I listen to the Sasquatch story from Sunbow True Brother, the Sasquatch accounts, the Sasquatch history goes back beyond the ant people to early ant people civilizations. And the way that converges with the Hopi myths made me go like, oh, wow. The history of humanity is so much older than we know about, so much older than we've led to believe. So don't lose hope. When I found out last night that a woman Jew was elected president of Mexico, and I knew about slave labor in Arizona coming through the railroad, and I knew about the aqueduct on the border to Arizona and California, I felt such a sense of despair, so much despair. And then my sleep was rather restless because I felt like I was in committee meetings all night. Committee meetings in Mexico all night long. Well, I won't call it night, I'll call it my sleep time. Oh no, the bioweapons are attacking me, jumping in my face. Yeah, I'm still getting hurt by these bioweapons. And I'm still wondering, what is this about? Is this really something to do with the future of humanity? Or is this just a parasite colony when they sold my flesh? When they sold my flesh and infected me with bioweapons? Because this happened after they kidnapped me and put me in their jail for hours and hours. And I didn't eat or drink anything there, but within 3-4 months, I started to get this. And it didn't matter that I had previous negotiations about, helping to birth the new humanity when we leave this planet. But maybe we don't leave this planet, the ant people saved a lot of the Four Corners Americans by bringing them to a safe space underground. But we're seeing a lot of earthquakes, aren't we? Deep earthquakes, according to Dutch Sense. who is really the finest seismological scientists that we've got. The professionals have gone against his work because they're envious, like Malinche. They've gone against his work and attacked Dutch. But if you want to learn about earthquakes and earthquake predictions, Dutch Sense is the place to go. Now, just like I don't try to learn remote viewing, I don't try to learn how to predict earthquakes. I just count on Dutch to do it. I call it delegating the work. I don't need to be an expert and know how to do everything, as long as there are people on the team that know how to do these things. Right? So Courtney Brown and Farsight, they do a great job with remote viewing. Future forecasters seem to be doing pretty good with remote viewing. If I want to know, about alien culture, I know where to go. And I share with you all my sources, not to put any other YouTube creator on the spot, but so that you yourself can go to my primary sources and find out for yourself. You can use the same data that I'm using. And you can find Silver Rain Runningcloud returned to cyberspace after Elon Musk and the Musketeers on Twitter drove her out. On that playlist, you can find most of the things that I look at. So that's sort of my bibliography, so that you can do the work for yourself. So let me go on. I feel I've talked here for almost an hour, and I'm sure you're tired. And I haven't even eaten or anything. I stay up pretty late and sleep a lot in the daytime, in the mornings. But I use these broadcasts to help keep me focused on the future, so that I don't sink into despair over things like a shine bomb president of Mexico in North America. A shine bomb president. It's just amazing. But once you see that if you dare say that election 2020 was a fraud, you can end up going to jail like the January 6 people did. And they'll keep reminding you the consequences of having your own thoughts, of thinking you're in a democracy and not a fascist dictatorship. And then after they take this effigy of Donald Trump and beat him up using the judiciary and leave him falling down, silenced, invalidated, criminalized, they go after his friends next, Giuliani. When the Europeans first came after me in Arizona, I thought it was because they knew about my relationship with Trump. I mean, anybody knew I was supporting him. I made that very obvious in my social media. And every time I heard that they were taking out Trump supporters, I wondered, am I a part of that? But I was doing so much work, so much recognizance, so much documentation of European corporations stealing land from the Americans and from the Indians and creating, all these horrible things. Raytheon, right there on the border. Raytheon, privately owned silver mine, right there in Arizona, near Utah, near the jail they put me in the second time in the same night. They put me in 2 different jails in the same night after kidnapping me. There weren't even any charges against me. And they ran it through 3 different courts because it was such a flimsy case, until they found just the right person, Tina Ainley, whose husband died in Austria, home of the Nazis. But let me get to the point of this, okay? Let me get to the point of this. How will a Jew woman in the highest seat of power in Mexico affect the individual lives of the people that are really Mexican? The fact that they have appointed or put a woman in power means that the Gloria Steinem effect will go much faster there. Okay? It took time for us to go from Gloria Steinem popularizing lesbian feminism to Married with Children, where a lazy slut is the mother of the children in a show that comes on when children are most likely to be watching television. So it took time for the blood libelists to manipulate public broadcasting to bring women from the level of Ozzie and Harriet, right? Where they're always trying to teach their children. The mother cooks dinner. The mother's very involved. To go from that all the way down to Married with Children took decades. It took them decades to break down the concepts of womanhood in American society. And they had to use the economic system. They had to use the economic system to force us out. But they learned how effective it was. They learned that once you take women out of the domestic space crumbles. And what is held in the domestic space is community development and community strength. Because each woman is the ruler of her household, and each woman is interested in having a community for her children to be a part of, resources for her children, activities for her children, friends for her children, a whole social context for her children is what women in the domestic space create. So once they removed women from the domestic space where you're creating the recreation, you're creating the education, you're creating the society that raises children, the children exist in. Once you remove that and you've got nothing but blood libel and video games, well, you can really undermine concepts like, there's a big word for when your children are loyal to you. Moses calls it in the 10 Commandments, honoring your mother and father. Well, if your mother and father are always at work, what are you going to honor them for? Honestly. Your allowance that you're using to buy drugs and beer? What are you going to honor your parents for if your parents are not honestly involved in your upbringing? And if you've got an economic system that demands two parents work and worry about their job when they're not working and spend most of the fruitful part of a day sitting on their fat asses in a high rise, feeling important, but no work, it was just another way to have a prison, just another way to rob the people. So what Gloria Steinem launched when she started talking about feminism, she wasn't trying to protect heterosexual mothers that wanted to stay home and were more interested in stopping their husbands from drinking, because when they watched TV, they saw beer commercials, they saw drinking commercials, liquor was sold liberally. They were more interested in stopping their husbands from drinking, as you found with Candy Staten and the Temperance League. Drunken men were more of a problem that needed to be addressed for women that were interested in improving the domestic space. And outside the domestic space, men were providers. Now, if they were providers through business, that was great, right? But the traditional gender-based role that's encoded in all of us, where it says that the man provides for his family, the man protects his family, and the woman makes sure that the family is worth protecting. They destroyed all that with feminism, right? They destroyed all that with feminism. And Gloria Steinem, a Jew woman, was the face of all that. She was the face of all of that. So it took them decades to do that here, but look how quickly it's going to happen in Mexico when you say that the new Gloria Steinem is President Scheinbaum. Okay? And let me explain to you, I think I'm ready now to go into, I think I've laid the ground. The role of women developing the domestic space. How the destruction of the role of women using the economy, the corporate economy, has led to the collapse of the community, which has led to the aimlessness of the children and the misery of the children, which has led to homelessness, drug addiction, poverty, a loss of a sense of purpose, aimlessness. All of these social maladies can be traced back to Gloria Steinem and feminism, because that was a direct attack on American domestic space and the true labor of women, right? The true labor of women, the labor that fulfills women. Now, not every woman wants to be a mother, and I'm okay with that. Not every woman wants to be heterosexual. Fine. Although I'd like to see how many homosexual communities can reproduce themselves and continue to survive. I would love to see an independent world of homosexuality, because it seems to me that you've got to have heterosexuals first. So if you don't secure the heterosexuals, you're not going to have anybody, including homosexuals and lesbians, is how I see it. Homosexuals do not reproduce. They're donkeys. Like when you take a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, and a mule is sterile. A mule cannot have offspring. So if you take a donkey, a woman, and a horse, stallion, a man, they're going to give, the mare is going to give birth to a mule. And a mule is sterile. Okay? So if homosexuals are mules, they're not going to have children. And if they do have children with a heterosexual woman, what kind of domestic space will come from that? You'll have a very unhappy heterosexual woman who's always looking for the attention of her husband. You'll have children that want the attention of their father, but their father will be out with the men. Their mother will be out with the women, because they'll be being lesbians and homosexuals. And I don't have anything against them. I'm just saying that heterosexuals gotta live. So Gloria Steinem came in with a big scythe to cut the future of womanhood down. She came in with the scythe of homosexuality, lesbianism. She came in with the scythe of feminism, wiping out women's roles in the domestic space. And she came out attacking men. Male chauvinist pigs was the phrase that she developed. And that became such a snowball where it came toxic masculinity. And then the law got involved and started prosecuting men. And it's so bad now that men don't even know how to approach a woman to ask her for a date. They don't even know how to seduce a woman, because they don't know when they're out of bounds, because all of the distortions have told them, don't count on your feelings. Don't count on what you feel coming back from her. And even the women have occupied the space of controversy and defining and redefining, rather than submitting to the natural order, is what I'm going to call it. Okay? I'm going to call it submitting to the natural order. Because did it ever occur to you that maybe men don't have the kind of temperament required to build communities? That maybe men have aggression in them? Maybe it's a part of the way God made men. Because if you have aggression, you can be a good hunter. And a good hunter is going to bring a lot of protein in to the tribe. The hunters are celebrated by the tribe because they provide. And if you've got a lot of Norsemen looking to come and rob your baskets and your turquoise, wouldn't it behoove you to have a lot of men that were aggressive, a lot of men that spent the day practicing fighting and enjoying it? I mean, there is biological basis to gender difference. And for us to let blood libel wipe it out was one of the first ways that they destroyed our community, our family, and our individual sense of purpose. So in the Mexican culture in particular, some lesbians came out in feminism. But more than being lesbians, they were authors, they were writers, they were creative writers. And the one that became most important to me is Cherry Moraga. That's Chrrie Moraga, Moraga. And she published a book that I'll tell you more about later, because I have to read it from Google. Okay, Cherry Moraga. She came out in 1981 with This Bridge Called My Back, and it was an anthology. The 40th anniversary edition was published in 2021 by the State University of New York Press. And it was co-edited by another very famous Chicana author named Gloria Anzaldúa. So in The Bridge Called My Back, Cherry Moraga taught me a lot about machismo, la Malinche, and Chicano cultural traditions as they relate to women. I'm going to read this to you from sherrymoraga.com. That's CherrieMoraga.com. And from the Cherry Moraga website, this is the book that I read. And she's the one I did that great oral presentation on, was her poetry. So she made a big impression on me. But when I tell you about La Malinche, you'll see how this really relates to the Mexican, to my sense of incredulity that real Mexicans would have elected a woman to be the president and a Jew woman. That's like a strike in bowling. All those pins fall down. Quote, originally released in 1981, This Bridge Called My Back is a testimony to women of color feminism as it emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century. Through personal essays, criticism, interviews, testimonials, poetry, and visual art, the collection explores, as co-editor Cherry Moraga writes, the complex confluence of identities, race, class, gender, and sexuality, systemic to women of color oppression and liberation. Reissued here 40 years after its inception and introduced by Moraga in part as an honoring of Bridge ancestors, this 5th edition also contains Moraga's extensive 2015 introduction, along with a reprint of personal statement by Gloria Anzaldúa. The new edition includes visual artists whose work was produced during the same period as Bridge, including Betty Saar, Ana Mendaliera, and and Yolanda Lopez, as well as more current contributor biographies. Bridge continues to reflect an evolving definition of feminism, one that can effectively adapt to and help inform an understanding of the changing economic and social conditions of women of color in the United States and throughout the world. Bridge turns 40. So that's what it says on the Sherry Moraga webpage. But during reading that book and creating the report, I learned about machismo. Machismo was the attitude of Mexican men that feminists would describe as a most extreme form of chauvinism. Machismo. I don't know if it's here. And I'm going to read just from Wikipedia. From Wikipedia, machismo, that's machismo. Machismo is the sense of being manly and self-reliant, a concept associated with a strong sense of masculine pride and exaggerated masculinity. Machismo is a term originating in the early 1930s and 40s, best defined, and that's when zoot suits were really popular. So that sense of vanity among the West Coast Mexicans. Best defined as having pride in one's masculinity. While the term is associated with a man's responsibility to provide for, protect, and defend his family, machismo is strongly and consistently associated with dominance, aggression, grandstanding, and an inability to nurture. The correlation to machismo is found to be deeply rooted in family dynamics and culture. Okay, that's the first paragraph of the definition of machismo. So you see, it is the role of the male, but it's seen as being more pronouncedly performed than the Europeans would. Because when they say it's more, they mean in relation to the European. That's where double consciousness comes in, where the central point of view, the baseline, is what the Europeans think. So while machismo in Mexico, where the land is very hostile, there are a lot of rugged mountains, okay? You've got to traverse very difficult terrain if you want to see your girlfriend in another village, and dangers could be on the way. Coyotes, mountain lions, different dangers along the way. You cannot be faint of heart and live in Mexico and be a man. So while machismo from a European standpoint might be seen as exaggerated, from the cultural context that it's in, it's normal. Okay? So when they say it's exaggerated, okay. So we all know that California, Arizona, Texas used to be Mexico, but the manifest destiny pushed the Europeans to make war, and that the Black Buffalo Soldiers were a part of it. The Texas Rangers were a part of it. That the Europeans decided that they were going to take the land from Mexico, but they couldn't get all of it, right? But they got enough of it. Working with the French, Louisiana, okay? So where the Europeans had established forts and military presence, the United States of America was going to pull all of that in under one hat. So California used to be Mexico. Arizona used to be Mexico. That's why you get so many Incas and Aztec Indians living in Arizona and the Four Corners area. And there were no boundaries. So people used to cross over from Mexico into, they used to travel the whole United States as much as they wanted to. As much as they wanted to, they could travel the United States. Okay? So you see that it's deeply rooted machismo. Inroads Incorporated, Chicago, tried very hard to get the Spanish-speaking Americans involved, the Spanish-speaking American women involved in working for European corporations like they were with the blacks. And the blacks, we blacks and we black Indians, we didn't have a problem with it because I don't know why. I guess because we've been working outside of our home, taking care of European families and children, and I don't know why. But let it suffice to say that when I talked to the executives at Inroads Incorporated Chicago, they told me that they can't recruit Spanish-speaking American women because their culture does not encourage them to work outside their home and develop professional careers, that their culture is more interested in them becoming good mothers and wives, cooking for their husbands, taking care of their children, actually doting on them, was the reputation that the Spanish-speaking mothers of America had. Doting on their children. Their children were the centers of their lives, was the stereotype, the archetype that was presented. So if you know that there are cultural roots that created machismo, and if you know that culture is transmitted in some of that junk DNA, then you know that there are a lot of Mexican men and women that feel an internal sense of individual disruption and defeat over this so-called elected Jew woman president, female Jew president. Because like Gloria Steinem, over decades, her ideology disrupted the American woman's ability to create a healthy domestic space. This is going to hit them like a tsunami. Like a tsunami. There's going to be resentment in the home between men and women that were abused and oppressed, which you find, in every society because of the nature of men and the nature of women. And rather than work that out, it's been exaggerated. So you're going to find women seizing upon this new identity that they can have this external world power. And it's just not true. Because they'll be slaves like me and you. Because they didn't elect this person. They didn't elect this person. It would be against their cultural values. One of the things that I learned from Sherry Moraga as well is La Malinche, the concept of La Malinche. And La Malinche is an archetype that is more ancient and powerful. It's more ancient and powerful in Mexico than Eve. Because Christianity and the story of Eve and the downfall of Adam came to America after the Mexicans already were established and had their culture. The missionaries were actually used as a way to infiltrate and destroy indigenous culture. As you can see in the movie with Robert De Niro in it called The Missionary. But bring your handkerchief, you're going to cry. Oh, I forget it. Okay, so let me read what you can find on Google about La Malinche. And once again, I'm going to use Wikipedia. Wikipedia has not been as corrupted as the rest of the internet with blood libelist machinations. La Malinche is a Nahua woman from the Mexican Gulf Coast that became known for contributing to the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. She's essentially their Pocahontas. Only because they don't have Europeans saying Pocahontas was good, they treat their Pocahontas as a traitor of their people for acting. La Malinche was Marina Malzin, and she became known as La Malinche because she acted as an interpreter, advisor, and intermediary for the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. La Malinche, Marina Malinchen, was one of 20 women, enslaved women. Enslaved is a contexted term for me. But she was one of 20 women given to the Spaniards in 1519 by the natives of Tabasco. Now let me tell you that that's written in the European language. And if I was writing it, I might see it differently. I might see it as, once these guests arrive, I let some of the women from my community go to cook for them and watch out for them as visitors, as guests. Okay? So I don't think that they were necessarily enslaved women. I don't think the Europeans really had a context for understanding slavery in America, because I don't believe that slavery in America was the same as slavery in Europe, because slavery means you work for free, right? It means you work for free for the benefit of everybody. So anytime you work for free, you're, by their definition, you're a slave. So when they say an enslaved woman in Spain, it's to set in your mind the idea that there was a hierarchy and that the Spaniards were not slaves, and the Spaniards were entitled to treat other women without dignity as slaves. You have to remember that everything we see are pretty much fictionalizations of an imagined future from a people in a Western context. And Western culture follows African culture. Egyptian culture follows African culture. Arabic culture follows African culture. And the idea of slavery in Africa was never, ever, ever like slavery in these other countries. I mean, in European countries. So I'm not really good with this description of Marina Malinche, because it's very possible that in 1519, when the Spaniards came, they were just trying to be hospitable. Okay? Because the Tabasco people were located in the southeast of Mexico. So it would have been a place that the Spaniards could have reached there on the east coast. Anyway, it says Cortés chose her as a consort, like they were there, right? And what's a consort? A consort is a way to degrade a wife. If you call her a consort means the man is too good to be considered the husband of that woman, but she is his sexual partner and the one that he gives gifts to and the one he looks forward to seeing and the one that he loves. So there's a lot of politically charged terms in this Wikipedia article. Enslaved women, who said consort. But anyway, they had a son named Martin, and Martin was one of the first recognized mestizos, that is, people that were mixed with European, like American mulattoes are the mestizos. And they say in New Spain, but New Spain is Mexico. La Malinche's reputation has shifted over the centuries as various people evaluate her role against their own societies changing social and political perspectives, especially after the Mexican War of Independence, which led to Mexico's liberation from Spain. It says independence from Spain, but once again, independence, very, very European word. In 1821, dramas, novels, and paintings portray her as an evil or scheming temptress. In Mexico today, La Malinche remains a powerful icon, understood in various and often conflicting aspects as the embodiment of treachery, the quintessential victim, or the symbolic mother of the mestizo people. The new Mexican people is how it's put in this European document, written in European language. The term Malinchista was created to mean a disloyal compatriot, especially in Mexico. So you can see, and if you read Cherry Moraga, you'll see that this iconic archetype of La Malinche, the woman who submitted to the Spaniards and had the first mixed race child, that the Europeans have defined as a bastard when they say a consort instead of a wife, like anybody was, married in the 1500s. I don't know, maybe they were. So when you read Wikipedia and you see the enslaved and consort and the New Mexico and New Mexican people, they're asserting a political position. They're seeing it through a certain lens. The way that Cherry Moraga explained it was that La Malinche and Machismo were archetypes that existed within the personal relationships of men and women from that culture. That there was mistrust of women. There was fear of women mating with Europeans from Spain who were more exotic, perhaps had gifts from different lands. And how their race became mixed race, where you've got a person, if your daddy is European and your mommy is American, you're going to have the DNA from both of them, right? In America, they called it there's a whole term for mulatto that expresses a wicked mulatto, a mulatto with a bifurcated mind, bifurcated loyalty, a mulatto that's loyal to the Europeans, but not European, so able to infiltrate deeper into the pure black. So Malinche takes a very important role. And when we see the new president of Spain, and we know about Machismo and La Malinche, we have to ask ourselves, how did that happen? How did Mexican citizens put down these old, powerful traditions of not trusting women to be the voice between you and the Europeans, and of men being protectors and providers in a very obvious way? And it has everything to do with the landscape, with the topography of Mexico. They had to be tough. They had to be brave. They had to be strong. They had to be aggressively masculine to protect their women. And when you've got men like that, you're going to be soft. You are. You're just going to, because you don't have to worry about fighting. If you got to worry about fighting, you're going to come out a very different kind of woman than a woman that's comfy and safe in the suburbs, let's say. Okay? If you've got to go into corporate America and deal with European nationalist racism year after year after year for you to make your way, you're going to come out a very different woman from the European woman living in the suburbs whose husband goes to work every day and sits around the office or goes out to play golf. You're going to come out different. So the culture formed these people, but we're supposed to believe that in Mexico City, that's where Luis Marentes is from, and he had a very bad attitude there at UMass, who introduced me to this literature. That was great that I took a course that got introduced to this literature. Now I'm going to just talk about one more thing that I learned. I learned that the Mexicans in the arts community of California like to be called Chicanos and Chicanas. Chicanos and Chicanas. That they saw Mexican American as a term for the sellouts. They saw Mexican American as a term for the people that were integrating with the European economy, like La Malinche. And the culture had developed such a sense of trying to encourage people to have allegiance to La Raza. Perhaps you've heard the term La Raza, the race, the people. Well, the people who were working for higher consciousness of La Raza also developed the term pocho. Pocho, it means rotten potato. I think it means rotten potato. But they developed the term pocho. And I even read a novel about pocho. And pocho is a slang in the Spanish culture that describes, here, let me go here. This is just in the general part when you do a Google search and it comes up, but it doesn't say where it got it from. It says pocho, feminine pocha, is a term used by native-born Mexicans to describe Chicanos who are perceived to have forgotten or rejected their Mexican heritage to some degree. Okay? So we've got La Malinche, we've got Machisimo, we've got Lo Pocho, we've got Chicano, and we've got a Jew president lady, a Jew lady president. So when you know, like, we don't know these things about Mexican culture already because the blood libelists that control news in America have decided that news from Europe is more important than news from the Americas. They don't want us to create alliances with each other, right? They don't want us to see each other as in the same group with the same interests and the same intentions. They want us to see ourselves as different from Mexico. They want us to see ourselves as different from Canada, even though we are the same continent. We are continental cousins. So when the parts of America that had been taken over by the Europeans, when the parts of America known as Mexico were taken over by the Europeans, there were a lot of people who still had allegiance to Mexico and saw themselves as La Raza. And Americans from Mexican heritage also believed that Lo Pocho were bad things. They also tried to stop people from giving up Mexican culture, Mexican traditions. So you can't tell me that people in Mexico, with all of the small villages, all of their isolation from us, from our isolation from them, you can't tell me that they threw down their DNA encoded culture related to gender and elected a woman president when there was a man with a Mexican surname running for the same office without the same political machine behind him. He only got, a quarter of the vote? The campaigning in Mexico is very hard because of the mountains, because of the way the villages have developed in isolation, some virtually unchanged. But a European using the strategies of blood libel would find it much easier. But more importantly, they have experience and great success in stealing the vote and suppressing anybody that complains from what they've done in America. So what they've done in America to conduct a coup and take over our land and give all of our assets to privately owned European corporations took decades for them to achieve. But by appointing a Jew woman president of Mexico, things are going to go exponentially faster there in terms of depriving the Mexicans of their land, polluting their water and their land, creating laws that prevent them from self-sufficiency, centralizing their economy to become subservient to the European global economy. The operation that took generations to happen to us, the genocide that took generations to ruin me, is going to go much faster now that they've got a shine bomb, a shining tree. A tree. Timber. I think her name is Shine Bomb. I'm not sure. But I hope that I have at least let you learn new things about the Mexicans who are Americans, like me and my people. And I hope that you've learned enough to know that there is no way, except in hell, that can be a legitimate election any more than the 2020 election in this part of America was. But now they know how to silence the people. Now they know pretty much how the people will react. But most importantly, now they have the power to force the people to lose their lands, lose their waters, lose everything, all under the guise of a democratically elected government. But I want to know, do you really believe that the Mayorans would have elected nothing but Europeans to their government? Do you think that the Americans in the South in the 1800s, when most of the South was owned by Black Americans, do you honestly believe that they elected Europeans? Democracy was never what democracy taught was. Democracy was always about Europeans finding a political system that they could coerce other people to believe they had a stake in it, while the intention all along was just another European political system. And all European political systems are subject to the rules and the laws and the power of the monarchy. So at the end of the day, no matter where you go, no matter what you see, if you see Europeans in charge, it's a part of the European nationalism, which supersedes any land-based nation, right? We've got the Nation of Islam, okay? We've got the Nation of America. Nation of Islam, European nationalist racism, European nationalism. These kinds of nationalisms are ideology-based. So there are ideology-based nations which define a huge group of diverse people that believe in the same thing, diverse to a limit. And then you've got the nationality that comes with living in the same landmass, living in the same nation. Well, when it comes to being American, the North American continent, I'm going to say that everybody on the North American continent wants a life of autonomy in cooperation with others and other communities. I would dare say that we want to have cultural diversity when we travel, the cultural cohesion where we live. I'm going to dare say that we want domestic spaces to be cultivated and developed, and that women are inherently better at it because they actually carry within their own spiritual and physical space the lives that come here as humans. Not the clones, not the robots, but the human beings that come here through human reproduction. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you agree with me that it is extremely unlikely that the real Mexican people elected a woman with a Jew surname because the Mexicans don't want to lose their land. They don't want to lose their indigenous government. They don't want to be like we are here. They want to still have a chance at freedom.